200 people watched her get left at the altar because she couldn't walk. Her own fiancé abandoned her in front of everyone. But what happened next changed her life forever. This is Sarah's story, and it will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, rejection, and second chances. She was 20 minutes away from becoming a wife when the groom's mother stood up in front of 200 guests and said the words that would shatter her world. "My son will not marry a woman who can't walk." The church went silent. Her fiancé, the man who had promised to love her forever, looked at his mother, then at his bride in her wheelchair, and without a single word, he turned and walked out. Just like that. 3 years of love, gone in 30 seconds. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and 6 months before that wedding day, she had been a completely different person. She was a third-grade teacher in a small town in Ohio, the kind of woman who spent her weekends hiking and her evenings planning lessons for her students. She'd been with her fiancé, David Hartwell, for 3 years. He came from money, the kind of family that had their name on a building downtown, but he'd always seemed different from them. Grounded. Kind. Or so she thought. They'd met at a charity fundraiser where Sarah was volunteering, and David had told her she was the most beautiful woman in the room. 6 months later, he proposed on a beach in California. Then came the accident. Sarah was driving home from school one rainy afternoon in March when a truck ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of her car. She woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, and the doctor's words felt like they were coming from underwater. Spinal cord injury, permanent paralysis from the waist down. Her life as she knew it was over. The hiking, the running, the simple act of walking to her classroom, all of it gone. But David had been there, holding her hand, telling her nothing had changed, that he loved her exactly the same. David's mother, Patricia Hartwell, was the kind of woman who measured people by their usefulness and their appearance. She'd never fully approved of Sarah to begin with, thought her son could do better, someone from their social circle, someone with the right connections. But after the accident, Patricia's disapproval turned into something uglier. She started making comments, little digs that cut deep. How will you manage a household? What about children? People will talk, David. Sarah saw the way Patricia looked at her now, like she was broken, like she was something to be pitied or worse, discarded. But David kept reassuring her. The wedding was planned for October, a beautiful ceremony at the historic church where David's parents had been married. Sarah had worked with a physical therapist for months, determined to regain as much independence as possible. She learned to navigate her wheelchair with grace, to dress herself, to live her life with dignity despite the challenges. Her students sent her cards and videos, telling her how much they missed her and couldn't wait for her to come back. Her friends rallied around her. Her parents, who lived 2 hours away, visited every weekend. Sarah was surrounded by love, except from the one place it mattered most. 2 weeks before the wedding, Patricia came to Sarah's apartment unannounced. She sat down in the living room, looked around at the modifications Sarah had made to accommodate her wheelchair, and said, "I think you should call off the wedding." Sarah's heart dropped. "Excuse me?" Patricia folded her hands in her lap, the picture of composed cruelty. "You're a sweet girl, Sarah, but you're not what's best for my son. He's sacrificing his future out of guilt. You must see that." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "David loves me. He chose to stay with me." Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He feels obligated, but obligation isn't love. If you truly cared about him, you'd set him free." Sarah told David about the visit that night. He was furious, called his mother immediately and told her she was out of line. Patricia apologized, said she'd spoken out of concern, that she only wanted what was best for everyone. David seemed satisfied with that, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. She tried to talk to him about postponing the wedding, about giving his family more time to adjust, but David insisted everything would be fine. The morning of the wedding, Sarah woke up with a knot in her stomach. Her best friend Rachel helped her get ready, carefully arranging her veil, making sure every detail of her dress was perfect. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror and saw a bride, not a woman in a wheelchair, just a bride about to marry the man she loved. Her father came to pick her up, and when he saw her, tears filled his eyes. "You're beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, even though that knot in her stomach had turned into full-blown anxiety. Something didn't feel right. The church was packed. 200 guests filled the pews, friends and family from both sides, though Sarah noticed that David's side of the church was filled with people who looked at her with either pity or barely concealed judgment. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the altar where David was waiting. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. His mother sat in the front row, her face an unreadable mask. Sarah's father wheeled her down the aisle and she could hear the whispers, feel the stares, but she kept her eyes on David, on the man who had promised to love her. They reached the altar. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice steady and warm. Sarah's hands trembled as she held David's, and she could feel his palms sweating. He wouldn't quite meet her eyes. That's when she knew. Something was wrong. The officiant had just asked if anyone had any objections when Patricia Hartwell stood up. The entire church seemed to hold its breath. "I object," she said, her voice clear and cold. The officiant looked stunned. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is highly unusual." Patricia cut him off. "My son cannot marry this woman. She's paralyzed. She can't give him a normal life, children, a future. This is a mistake." The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in. She looked at David, waiting for him to defend her, to tell his mother to sit down, to choose her the way he'd promised he would. But David just stood there, frozen, his face pale. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Say something." He looked at his mother, then back at Sarah, and she saw it in his eyes. The doubt, the fear, the realization that he wasn't strong enough to go against his family. "I'm sorry," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Then louder, to the whole church. "I can't do this." And he walked away, just turned and walked down the aisle past his sobbing mother who was now playing the victim, past the stunned guests, out of the church and out of Sarah's life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah sat there in her wheelchair at the altar, her veil still perfectly in place, her bouquet still in her hands, completely unable to process what had just happened. The guests were whispering, some were crying, some were already getting up to leave. Rachel rushed to her side, but Sarah barely registered her presence. She felt numb, like she was watching this happen to someone else. 3 years. 3 years of her life, and he'd thrown it away in less than a minute because his mother told him to. The humiliation was crushing, but worse than that was the heartbreak. The realization that the man she'd loved had never really loved her at all, not enough to fight for her when it mattered. That's when she heard footsteps. Someone was walking toward the altar. Sarah looked up through her tears and saw a man she vaguely recognized. He'd been sitting on her side of the church, though she couldn't remember exactly how she knew him. He was in his late 30s, maybe 40, wearing a simple gray suit, and he had the saddest, kindest eyes she'd ever seen. He knelt down beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level. "Sarah," he said gently, "my name is Tom Chen. We met at the physical therapy center 6 months ago. You probably don't remember me." Sarah blinked, trying to place him, and then it clicked. He'd been there with his daughter, a little girl who used a wheelchair. They'd smiled at each other in the waiting room a few times, exchanged pleasantries, but nothing more. Tom took a deep breath, and Sarah could see he was nervous. "I know this is going to sound crazy," he said, "but I've thought about you every day since we met. I never said anything because you were engaged, you were happy, and I had no right. But I can't watch this happen to you. I can't watch them treat you like you're not worth loving when I know that's the furthest thing from the truth." Sarah's heart was pounding. She didn't understand what was happening. "What are you saying?" Tom stood up and held out his hand. "I'm saying, if you'll have me, I'll marry you. Right here, right now. You deserve to be someone's choice, Sarah. Let me be that person." The church went completely silent. Sarah stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. This was insane. She didn't even know this man. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in David's. Not even before the accident. She saw certainty. She saw courage. She saw someone who knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't afraid. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Tom smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Because 6 months ago, when I saw you in that waiting room, you were helping my daughter figure out how to do a wheelie in her chair. You spent 20 minutes with a child you didn't know, making her laugh, showing her that being in a wheelchair didn't mean her life was over. My daughter, Emma, she'd been so sad, so angry about her disability. But after meeting you, she came home smiling for the first time in months. You gave her hope. You gave me hope. And I've thought about you ever since." Sarah's mind was racing. This was completely absurd. You didn't marry a stranger, especially not at your own failed wedding. But as she sat there surrounded by people who had just watched her get humiliated, she realized something. What did she have to lose? Her dignity was already in shreds. Her heart was already broken. David had shown her that promises meant nothing, that love could evaporate the moment things got difficult. But this man, this stranger, was offering her something different. He was offering her respect. He was offering her a choice, and maybe, just maybe, he was offering her a chance at something real. "Okay," Sarah heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." The church erupted again, but this time with shocked gasps and excited murmurs. Rachel grabbed Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" Sarah looked at her best friend and nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The officiant, who had been standing there in stunned silence, cleared his throat. "Well, this is certainly a first, but if both parties are willing..." He looked at Tom. "Do you have a ring?" Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my wife's," he said quietly to Sarah. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time that day, they weren't tears of humiliation or heartbreak. They were tears of something she couldn't quite name yet. Hope, maybe, or possibility. Tom slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. The officiant went through the ceremony again, faster this time. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, Tom leaned down and kissed Sarah gently on the forehead. The church erupted in applause, and Sarah realized that the people who mattered, her friends, her family, her father who was crying openly in the front row, they were all cheering for her. Patricia Hartwell had already left, dragging David with her, but Sarah found she didn't care. They were gone, and good riddance. The reception was supposed to be at a fancy hotel, paid for by the Hartwells, but obviously that wasn't happening now. Instead, Sarah's family and friends, along with Tom and his daughter Emma, who'd been at the church with Tom's parents, all went to a local restaurant and threw together an impromptu celebration. Emma, who was 8 years old and had been born with spina bifida, wheeled right up to Sarah with a huge smile on her face. "Are you my new mom?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Sarah looked at Tom, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at Emma. "I guess I am," Sarah said, and Emma threw her arms around her. It was the strangest, most surreal day of Sarah's life. But as she sat there surrounded by people who actually cared about her, with a husband she'd known for all of 2 hours and a stepdaughter she'd just met, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Over the next few weeks, Sarah moved her things into Tom's house. She called the school district and arranged to transfer to a school closer to her new home. Her old principal was sorry to lose her but understood, and he made sure the transition was smooth. Sarah also started meeting with a therapist to process everything that had happened: the trauma of the accident, the betrayal at the altar, the whirlwind marriage to Tom. Her therapist pointed out that Sarah had a pattern of not trusting her own instincts, of letting other people define her worth. The accident hadn't made her less valuable, and David's rejection didn't mean she was unlovable. Tom was showing her that every single day. Tom was incredibly patient. He never pushed for anything physical, never made Sarah feel pressured to be a real wife before she was ready. They slept in separate rooms for the first 2 months, taking their time to really know each other. They went on dates, to movies and museums and restaurants, learning each other's favorite foods and pet peeves. Emma was thrilled to have Sarah around, and watching Tom with his daughter made Sarah fall in love with him a little more each day. He was an incredible father, patient and encouraging, and endlessly supportive. He helped Emma with her physical therapy exercises every morning, cheered her on at her wheelchair basketball games, and never once made her feel like her disability was a burden. 3 months after their wedding, Sarah and Tom finally talked about making their marriage a real partnership in every sense. They were sitting on the couch one evening after Emma had gone to bed, and Tom took Sarah's hand. "I need you to know," he said seriously, "that I don't see you as someone I'm doing a favor for. I don't see you as a project or a responsibility. I see you as my partner, as someone I choose every single day. I'm falling in love with you, Sarah, and I need to know if you feel the same way." Sarah's heart was pounding. "I do," she whispered. "I love you, Tom. I think I've loved you since that day at the altar when you saw me, really saw me, and didn't look away." 5 years after their wedding, Sarah and Tom were thriving. Sarah had been promoted to vice principal at her school and was working on district-wide accessibility initiatives. Tom's consulting firm had grown, and he was now working on major projects across the country, designing buildings that worked for everyone, not just the able-bodied. Emma was 13 now and an absolute force of nature, competing in wheelchair basketball at the state level and dreaming of the Paralympics. They were a family in every sense of the word, supporting each other, loving each other, building a life together. One day, Sarah ran into David at a coffee shop. He looked older, worn down, like life had been beating him up. He asked to talk, apologized for everything. He admitted he'd married someone his mother approved of and was miserable. He asked if they could try again. Sarah looked at him and felt nothing but pity. She told him she'd forgiven him long ago, but trying again would never happen. She was happy, married to a man who saw her as his equal, with a daughter she adored. She hoped David would find happiness, but he wouldn't find it by looking backward. As Sarah sits in the living room of the home she shares with Tom and Emma, she thinks about how getting her heart broken led her to real love. Sometimes rejection is protection. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best chapters. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you were Sarah, could you have forgiven David? Could you have said yes to Tom? How would you have handled being left at the altar? Think about it. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best chapters. Sometimes rejection is protection. Sometimes the person who walks away is doing you the biggest favor of your life, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. Sarah's story reminds us that our worth isn't determined by who chooses us or rejects us. It's determined by how we choose ourselves, by the courage we show in the face of humiliation, by our willingness to take a chance on something unexpected.